This is the Make Planning Make Sense podcast. I'm Aaron Zimmerman. I'm a director at Centro Planning Consultancy, and I'm your host. Our tailored planning approach on complex applications, appeals, and strategy turns potential into results for developers, landowners, and architects nationwide. My guest today is Will Powell, investment director at Downing. With incredible clarity, Will sets out the private sector's needs with the aim of restarting housing delivery. We cover how to catalyze home sales, decluttering decision-taking, having the right people on your team, reviving a culture of partnership, and more. Be sure to check out the podcast that Will hosts, Downing Funding Foundations. Personally, I'm a huge fan of episode 2. If you like today's episode, share it with your fellow Planimals, and please do follow the show. And remember, we're ultimately here for you. Whenever you have a complex project that needs excellent planners on the team, please get in touch. Find us on LinkedIn and stay in touch on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky at MPMS Podcast. Here's my conversation with Will Powell. Will Powell, investment director at Downing. Thanks for joining us today.
Good morning. Thanks.
As always, we like to start off with who you are and how you came to your role.
Thanks, Aaron. I'm Will Powell. I'm one of the investment directors at Downing LLP. We are, in simple terms, a fund manager. Been trading since the 80s, working across a few different investment strategies, fundamentally focused around real estate. So we have the team that I sit on, which invests directly in development funding for primarily living sector schemes across the UK. We lend to lenders indirectly, so bridging lenders and such like. And we also have teams across private equity and healthcare, energy and infrastructure, both solar, wind, and others within that field. And finally, a public equities team, which is the only one that's not real estate linked. So everything we do is in and around the real estate market. We know it well and we understand it, and it is ever evolving. But my principal role is direct customer-facing interaction, structuring, originating, and looking after development transactions in England, Scotland, and Wales. So that could be a loan of anything from 2 to maybe 30, 40 million across that sort of SME space in the development market.
And you have a podcast as well.
We do. It's we do. Sort of a humble plug. It's a recent incentive. We run. You kindly joined us on it a few weeks back. It's been a great marketing exercise and really just a very interesting finger on the pulse with people from various corners of the market. So we've had a house builder on there. We've had a central London developer. We've had yourself from the planning side, an architect, and we've got some other guests lined up for later this year. So hopefully a nice sort of cross-section of the market. And I think it's good for our listeners, and I'm sure it's the same for you guys through this, to hear different perspectives on the pros, cons, goods and bads of the market in its various forms, but also just give out information around what we're seeing and what others are seeing.
It was absolutely lovely to join you on the podcast. Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
And thank you.
Shout out as well to Charles Jabra at DLA.
Indeed. No, a great guest. Yeah.
I'm really excited to talk about planning with you because you are in the sector that planning regulates. And I think that's a really important perspective. Over the past few years, and in London especially, residential development has sort of dried as a subsector.
Sure.
Then you'll know better than anybody that it's so multifactorial. But I'm curious about where you see the most important sticking points amongst a collection of sticking points and where you see opportunities.
I think it's a really interesting point of discussion because too often people focus on singular issues and think that just by putting a sticking plaster over that singular issue, somehow we would have this magic fix. As you rightly identify, it is a plethora of issues that the resi market in particular is facing right now. And I think it's been felt most acutely in central London. And I think to answer the question, you have to kind of do two things. You have to zoom out and you have to maybe go back in time a little bit to see where we've came from and where we are now. If we go back to sort of 2008, 2009, when we had the crash, huge hit on the property market, big retrench from the lending market. A lot of lenders lost a lot of money. A lot of developers went out of business. It was a total reset for the UK real estate market. However, like with all things, there's always a recovery. And in London and across many of the key markets in the UK, 2011, 12, 13 saw a big resurgence in largely sales traction, which encouraged transactional activity on new development. That continued with vigor probably until 2016, when the Brexit referendum was the kind of next black swan event, if you like, that upset the status quo. There's been a few of those since.
The Natalie Portman moment.
Indeed. Yeah, indeed. We had a wobble, but actually perhaps some temporary pause, but then again, a pretty sensible recovery and some steady growth since. Wind it forward a little bit, some good years of largely Help to Buy funded sales activity, certainly for the house builders. I mean, a family relative of mine worked for one of the big PLC house builders and quoted to me once that in the year before they ended the Help to Buy scheme, 55% of their sales across their entire business were funded by Help to Buy. So yeah, indeed. So think about how that translates across, the whole market.
Yeah.
COVID was the next big event. We had a sort of period of huge uncertainty, but actually construction and development as an industry rebounded quite quickly, and the government were very keen to get construction sites open again. So where I'm going with this is just sort of explaining the context to the market we've had and the market we're now in. Since COVID, I don't want to get into a sort of macro political debate, but I think COVID was so damaging on so many fronts, both to the global economy and to the UK economy. Yeah. And we've really been chasing our tail for the last 5 years, 6 years from that event, because it was so damaging, both in terms of just general investor confidence, but also the sort of far-reaching implications of inflationary pressures and everything that's come with that. So in the period between 2020 to 26 now, we've seen cost inflation at the most recent figure I heard quoted was 36% cost inflation between 2020 and 26 on general build costs. I would argue some materials have been significantly higher than that, but that's the rough average.
So kind of 3 times higher than the overall inflation rate for the economy at large, which is also already unto itself deeply damaging.
Sure.
So 3 times worse than that.
So It is fundamentally a wild amount more costly to build a house than it was 5 years ago, in just plain and simple terms. Much of the country, probably as much as 40%, you simply can't build for less than you can sell it for. So you basically can't develop in 40% of the country. And on top of that, we've seen a period of very heavy rate rises across the cost of finance. We've seen a softening in the sales market, which has been driven by cost of living squeeze, higher mortgage rates, squeezed affordability, general affordability pressures across just the cost of a basic lifestyle across most of the UK.
Yeah.
And that has obviously driven down the ability for purchasers to buy and hold and move through the property ladder and across the market. I think within that, you've got so many different factors in what makes a successful development deal. And really where I try to come at whenever I talk about the market is trying to rewrite the narrative on how the public sees development. I think you and I work in the space. We see and speak to developers and counterparties and people that are involved in this market all day long.
Yeah.
You think you know it sort of quite well, but the Joe Public commenting on development, they're still, I think, largely brainwashed by this media narrative that developers are profiteering cowboys that just, get a consent, throw anything up and sell it for millions and off they sail into the Mediterranean. I can tell you firsthand, development is a very difficult industry to do well in and to make any money in whatsoever, because at every single juncture there is a challenge, and that challenge is far more significant now than it ever has been. And just to finish off on that point, one thing I didn't mention was the increased and ever increasing burden of tax and regulation on the industry, again since probably that COVID era, which on top of cost inflation has added a burden which some schemes just can't carry any longer. We've got BNG, Building Safety Act, nutrients neutrality requirements in some markets. The list goes on, and it's at a point where landowners can only drop their price so much. So you've got to make it work or the scheme never gets off the ground.
I think you've painted a really clear picture of a very diverse set of challenges. If we could kind of break it down a little bit, there's supply side challenges. So build costs, labor, financing costs, and I'll put planning there as well. And the need to get an appropriate amount of margin to de-risk something whilst also clearing that existing use value hurdle.
Yep.
And then on the other side, of course, there's the sort of disposal and demand for the units.
Yeah.
And to be super clear, it's not demand as in housing need, it's demand in the market. So we're speaking about a certain slice of the consumer pie that could have enough money to get the down payment or to cover the costs of the mortgage and service charge and everything else.
It's multifaceted. I mean, it's not a magic wand, but I think the most impactful step that local and national government could take to address what is a fairly depressed general resi market. There are still transactions going on, but the numbers are appallingly low. In London last year, it was something like 5,000 to 10,000 homes in London were delivered in the whole of 2025 against a target of about 90,000. The numbers like that were seen in the depths of the global financial crisis. It's appallingly bad. And I do think the mayor and the GLA have to look at this and think about, well, we can't place the blame here all on the private sector. The private sector want to get on and build. Maybe we need to think about some of the policies that are preventing them. And
what? No,
I can't possibly comment. But the supply side constraints, I think, can be managed because I think an appraisal can be built on the back of confidence in the disposal side constraints. And if you fix the exit, I think you fix more of the entry. I'm not saying it's a golden ticket to total market recovery, but I think if you give buyers and investors the confidence that when you build X or Y, there will be a market for you to get rid of it. That drives transactional confidence, that drives transactional activity. The challenge for resi developers in particular has been that historically, when markets have been good, you go through your work to put together a site, you buy it, you plan it, you go through a period of time of designing that scheme, you build it, hopefully you build it on cost and you manage that properly, you market that scheme, and in a sensible period of time, say 6 to 12 months, depending on the size of the scheme, you sell those units or the bulk of the units out to the open market. You pay off your debt, you make your margin, and you move on to the next scheme. It's, in theory, not rocket science. Where resi developers have either come unstuck or found it very challenging in the most recent time is because that sales market, that disposal market has dried up to an extent where it's very price conscious, it's very data driven, affordability is squeezed. You've got people saying, well, actually, I can't take a risk on selling a scheme over 3 years that would have previously taken me 12 months because the cost of carrying that extra time doesn't work. And we've seen huge institutional capital investment in build to rent, for example, where there is a shorter exit tail because the rental market's been so strong. You can get a building complete or a set of buildings complete, you can get them rented and you can refinance or sell or whatever you plan to do. So it's no wonder that rents have been going up in light of this.
Yeah. I think there's two really important points that come from that. And one is just a reminder to all of our dear listeners, the market housing pays for the affordable housing, right? So it does matter if there is a collapse in demand for the market housing.
Yeah, sure.
Because that is what's subsidizing the housing that we need. And like you say, it's not rocket science, but I'm just emphasizing that point because I think that point is missed in some conversations with local authorities, for example, where they say, well, we don't need more market housing, we need affordable housing. It's like, but that's going to be funded through a cross-subsidy model, so you kind of need it all, right? Yeah. And the other point that I think was really useful to hammer home is that relationship between time and viability. Time is money. I didn't coin the term.
but it is. Yeah.
Exactly. So like that cost of the interest and all of the little things as well, like, maintaining the asset until disposal is an impact on viability. And as you're suggesting, right, whether a developer even goes in for it because they don't want to be sitting on a whole ocean of like brand new cars if they can't get them off the lot.
It's a good point. And I'll give you a few anecdotal examples as to just how pinching that can be on small or large schemes. There are many, but Building Safety Act came in for very well-intentioned reasons. No one can sort of deny the backdrop of why it came in, but like with a lot of these things, it takes time to implement and actually feed through to a commercial sort of execution capability that actually can get deals done in a sensible period of time. Yeah. But it's still not perfect, but it's a far sight better than it was. If someone's buying a site that's over 6 stories or 18 meters, they are now faced with a conundrum of, we know we've got planning, but we don't know when we're going to get gateway. So they are carrying cost and time risk that they previously weren't. And the narrative that all of these policies miss, which I don't blame them for doing it because they're just policies and they kind of leave it to the private sector to figure out how to deal with them. But
which is kind of a problem.
And that is a problem unto itself. But how does anything get off the ground in any country, whether it's the UK or otherwise? And sorry to say it so bluntly, but it's money. You don't build anything without money. And where does that money come from? Well, it's probably coming from some sort of funder or some sort of investor or partner. And in order for them to take a risk on a piece of land or a building or a regeneration site, they have to have some confidence that their money is not going to be lost. That confidence comes from, well, are we actually going to achieve the business plan? And are we going to see a return on our money over a sensible period of time? So Building Safety Act is one. On the residential side, developers are liable to pay council tax on empty, unsold units the moment that they're finished. For me, that just feels a very strange sort of reverse loophole that could be easily closed. I think it's absolutely right that buyers from the moment they own it should be paying council tax liabilities on those homes because they then owe them just the same as everyone. But holding unsold finished stock, if you think of a small to medium sized scheme of say 20, 30 houses, and every single one of those is, I don't know, £200 to £300 a month, and you're holding on the market those units for a year, it's not an insignificant sum of money.
Yeah.
And all of that is coming out of the margin. So little things. There are some easy wins that could be there for the market. And without that disposal confidence, these things are just tempering it even further.
Yeah. Especially because the services that the council tax is covering aren't relevant yet. Like there's no bin collection.
Well, indeed.
There's no one there.
Yeah, indeed.
So if we continue on this kind of dual perspective, right? There's the disposal, Help to Buy, it sounds would be something that you'd be happy to see return.
In some form. I think it was probably abused a bit by the national house builders, if I'm being honest.
Damn.
Yeah.
How so?
I don't want to be sort of PLC bashing because the PLCs have a rightful place in the market and many of them do a very good job. But if I'm honest, some of them have got away with building poor quality stock that they have run a successful balance sheet model on by utilising government sales incentives to drive cash flow. The sector of the market that I work within, the SME market, they don't have the advantage of a FTSE lifted PLC balance sheet behind them. Many developers that I deal with are pretty sort of hand to mouth is probably an extreme description of it, but their capital is all in on one scheme.
Yeah.
Their time and effort is all in on one scheme. And if they're lucky and if they do the job right and if the market stays with them, they might get some money out in 3 or 4 years' time. That's a hell of a risk to take.
Absolutely. Yeah. So they don't have that cushion of some massive portfolio turning over in the background.
No,
is the point. Yeah.
Absolutely not. The narrative that the public misses on development is a developer, just like an entrepreneur starting a business, is putting capital into something that at the time they're putting capital into it has hope and potential value, but at that particular moment has limited value. It is an opportunity, a piece of potential, whether it's a land, a building, a green field, whatever. They then have to put together time, cost, funding, work in design, in planning, in build cost procurement, all that stuff.
Which is all zero return at that
all
time.
Zero return.
And all high risk as well.
All high risk. They're not getting anything back. So they've taken their pot, they've put that all in, they've gone all the chips in the middle of the table. They're then going through a planning system which has slowed down. So they might be all in on a site and then they're still waiting 12, 18 months before they can even start. So there's 18 months of no salary again. They're then building it through a tricky cost inflationary market where the average length of a scheme that we fund might be 18, 24 months worth of building works. So there's another 2 years. So you're now at 3.5 years. And then if you're lucky, you might sell out of a small to medium sized scheme in this country in 6 to 12 months. So you're now at 4.5 years. Now, the first half of those sales goes to the bank that funded you to pay back their debt. The last third of those sales might, if you're lucky, if there's any money left in the scheme, come to you.
Which is not strictly profit, it's profit once you've also paid yourself back for all of the planning costs and the architect's fees and the professional fees, yeah.
Indeed. So you, as a developer, have carried in that example, 4 to 4.5 years worth of time, cost, and market risk that you then could have done everything right on, and you still don't end up with much at the end. Now, if you do everything right and you do end up with a decent margin at the end, well done. You deserve it for that level of risk, because alongside that level of risk, you have carried perhaps a personal guarantee on that loan. You've had to keep the wolf from the door with making sure contractors and subcontractors are paid on time. It is a multifaceted and highly complex set of skills to be a successful developer.
Yeah. So let's try to make it make sense. Let's try to make it a bit better. Just one question left actually on the Help to Buy scheme. We were speaking with Uliana Kuzmis at Palace Capital UK on the podcast in season 1. A really good episode if you want to check it out. She was suggesting that she would also want Help to Buy to be reintroduced. But to your point, she would want it to be reintroduced in a way that would apply to any first home purchase, not just new build construction.
Sure.
Do you think that would shift what you were mentioning about sort of the PLC incentive structures?
Perhaps. I actually think an alternative reform would fix 2 issues that we're talking about here in one, which is actually stamp duty reform. The tax take for Whitehall on stamp duty across the country is not significant in the grand scheme of the tax take of the UK. Most of that, well, historically, perhaps not now, most of that came from London. Stamp duty on a £200,000 home in the northeast is not significant ticket for the government. Stamp duty on a £5 million house in Holland Park is a decent lump of money.
Yeah.
Help to Buy was good generally for the buoyancy in the market because, to my earlier point, it gave investors and developers the confidence that they could sell the stock through because the argument was the barrier to entry for people buying was the affordability on the deposit, not the mortgage payments.
Yeah.
So by the government giving you a 5-year free crutch to get your deposit, they were backing the UK market by saying we're taking an equity stake in the UK market. We're helping buyers in London with a 40% deposit. We're helping buyers outside of London with a 20% deposit. And we share the upside and the downside. I don't know what the figures are, but I'm sure they've done very well on the upside across a net balance. Now, what Help to Buy did is it supercharged the volume house building market because across regions in the UK, the big PLCs were able to just churn that stock quicker than anyone else because they've got the balance sheet power. It also helped the SME developers, of course, because in the same way that it gives the PLCs confidence, it gives the SMEs confidence. But actually, the median sort of issues across people getting onto the housing ladder and moving through the housing ladder, if that's even a concept anymore, is that cost barrier to make that change from rental accommodation into home ownership.
Yeah.
And I would argue that one of the biggest cost barriers there is stamp duty. The average home in London is somewhere probably in the range of £450,000 to £600,000 now. I don't know the live figure, but it's probably in that range. I would imagine for a house in zone 1 to 3, it's probably significantly more than that.
Yeah.
But if we say average house price, somewhere in that 450 to 600 range, you're looking at £15,000 to £25,000 worth of stamp duty. You get up between 600,000 and £1 million, which in the southeast of England will get you a sensible house, but not a palace. You're looking at £20,000 to £40,000 worth of stamp duty in that range. Now, you can't add stamp duty to the mortgage. You can't
amortize it.
You can't amortize it. You can't spread it out. It's a lump sum, just money out the door. And you add that onto legal fees, moving costs, general property dressing, furniture, all that sort of stuff. It starts adding up. And that's on top of a deposit that you need.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to sit here and give the government 5 different alternative solutions to how we could address it. But stamp duty reform feels like an easy win for the market, in my opinion. I think it would partially fix some of the sales constraints that we've got, disposal constraints at the moment. I think it would free up the market in other parts, not just first-time buyers, because second movers, downsizers, the same problem that a first-time buyer faces are the same problem that a downsizer in their late 60s faces. They want to sell their 5-bed home that they raise their children in, and they want to move down to a 2-bed flat on the seaside because that's where they want to spend their retirement. There's still a stamp duty cost to that.
Yeah.
Now, they might be equity rich from their house, but they're still then having to part with £20,000, £30,000 in their later years on just the cost of buying. For me, that's an easy win. Government could find whatever stamp duty brings in somewhere else very easily. And I don't think it is a big tax take. I don't think they see much from it. I think they're just scared of reform.
So the stamp duty has a perverse incentive, or just really quite straightforwardly, it disincentivizes moving home.
It absolutely does. And the cost of living has increased wildly in the last 5 or 6 years.
Preach.
To a point where, the ability for the average UK worker to save has been massively reduced. And to free up cash flow to enable you to have the disposable capital to do these things, you've either got family assistance through generational wealth of some description, whether that's small or large. You have lived a lifestyle whereby you are way under your affordability and therefore you're able to, but there is a bottom threshold limit to that. There's only so cheaply that someone can live and work in London, as an example.
Yeah.
Or you're in a job that pays you enough that you've got that sort of cream on the top that you can save and put into something like that. And the percentage of people that are able to do that is vastly reducing.
Yeah.
We're in a position where it's not the affordability of the homes that I think is the issue, because in most London markets and Southeast markets, rents far outstrip what it would cost to buy on a mortgage payment at a sort of average example.
Yeah.
And so we know that it's not the general affordability. I think the median household income within zones 1 to 3 is something like 120,000 a year across generally a 2-person household. These people can afford the average house price in London. What they might not be able to afford is the cost of getting into that average house price.
Yeah.
And I think that's a better solution than just a big sales incentive like Help to Buy Again.
Yeah. This is all really helpful stuff, because I think it gives a really clear picture of how the market could make housing more accessible to more people on the disposal side by improving that accessible affordability of the home. Because like you say, the money is there. I lived in an HMO in Streatham Hill for like 3 years with friends, like with our combined income, none of which was like exorbitant, right? We were still in like a 95th percentile for household income if you added all three together, and also not saving that much.
Yeah.
And your point about that gap as well between what you'd have to save each month to eventually just get a down payment on your own. Like if you're eating nothing but like chicken, rice and broccoli from Aldi for like 3 years, would you still be able to save up for that down payment?
Sure.
Because you're also paying rent, which is exorbitant. We'll be right back. At Centro, our tailored approach turns potential into planning permission for major development projects nationwide. Every project is unique, and our analytical and persuasive approach delivers the best possible results for our clients. Our team's diverse insights are essential to creative problem solving, and together, we're proud to plan for a sustainable future. Get in touch if we can help. Find us on LinkedIn and online at centroplan.co.uk. So there are some potential solutions on that side. And I want to turn to the more sort of, it's not quite supply side, strictly speaking, but we might call it pre-completion stuff. Everything from acquisition through to the act of development itself.
Sure.
We've talked about materials. There are probably different ways that economies of scale could be better implemented, or domestic material sourcing could be a government focus for policy. But I agree with what you were saying a few minutes ago, that probably the densest group of levers that we can look at are kind of within this planning and taxation bubble.
It's the cost of getting into a deal, isn't it? And I don't want to keep harping on as if this is a sort of downbeat conversation, because there are still plenty of positives and there are still plenty of people doing well and thriving in this market, but under very challenging macro conditions. You've got to be very good to do that. To bring it on to planning, which is your specialism and is a market that clearly you have great expertise on.
Thank you.
The burden of complexity and time and sort of unknown that this sort of ever-growing white paper of planning rules seems to capture just doesn't make it any easier for people to get on and do what the government, well, not just this government, but any government has always wanted, which is how do we get this supply-demand problem in the UK fixed? And that's by building more homes. And every government for the last 3 or 4 terms has made it increasingly more difficult to build homes. 1.5 million over 3 years. I'd be amazed if they get anywhere close to 300,000. It's so wildly aspirational that it's not even in the realms of realism.
Yeah.
And the industry sometimes comes under fire. You hear phrases like land banking, developers sitting on sites. I can tell you now, if the environment for a developer to get on and do what they want to do with a site was there, no one would sit on any sites. No one intentionally, as far as I'm aware and what I see, no one intentionally buys a site and then doesn't do anything with it for ages, because all the time that they own it, it's costing them money. The reason they might buy a site and sit on it is because in the time that they've bought it to the time that they're in now, something on a macro, political, planning, regulatory level has changed insofar that it has altered the viability or the appraisal that site was built on. And that's not sustainable. We're in an environment where, from one local authority to the next, whether it's London or across the country, rules seem to be interpreted in different ways.
Understatement.
Yeah, there is not a blanket approach. I think it is far too political at a local and a national level. Housing is a need. It is a basic right of a population, subject to affordability, of course, but people need somewhere to live. They need shelter. They need affordable homes. They need private homes. They need communities. They need places. They need regeneration, because these things are underpinning a growing population. And if we don't allow the private sector to go on and get out there and fulfill that need, the public sector are not going to fill the hole. I just wanted to sort of move it onto the affordable housing debate, because the way that the system's run at the moment clearly does have some positives for local and national government on affordable housing delivery, because they just see it as, okay, developer wants consent, well, we can get something out of this, we can get a 106 payment, we can get 85 new homes in our community, they'll pay for the doctor's surgery. But you can also argue that that's not the responsibility of the private sector to do all that. They may need to contribute, but to the levels that we're talking about on most viabilities, it's getting to the point of unsustainability. And I just wonder whether actually that model of every private scheme that you bring forward has to have this percentage payment requirement. It's not fit for purpose anymore. It creates, I think, sometimes communities that aren't totally cohesive. It creates pricing dislocations. It creates lack of transactional activity because viabilities are getting so squeezed on the numbers from the requirements to do that. And actually, I feel like it would be better handled by national government on providing affordable housing across the UK. There are the skills and the expertise in the UK to roll it out on a different model, and I would challenge them to do that.
Yes. Yeah, completely agree. And that's kind of all there is to it. And we've had people on the podcast or catching up with us after a DRP or down at the pub or whatever it is. Nobody has said anything contrary to the fact that the government needs to start doing the government things, right? Like, we have an NHS, but developers have to build GP surgeries. We have tax, but developers have to pay for affordable housing, like, which they also aren't allowed to own then. It has to go to a nonprofit or to government to own. Shouldn't the state just operate the functions of a state?
Well,
Call me crazy.
I think so. And I don't want to go too political, because this issue is true of whatever government's in charge. This is not a pop at Labour as it was a pop at the previous government. It's more just the way that we're running our country as it relates to housing, I think, is ripe for change, because the private sector have proven themselves to be capable and risk on enough that, trust me, the houses will be built if you allow them the environment in which to do it. I know there is huge nuance to that. We don't want a country that is overrun with sort of soulless development, but I actually would counter that in that certainly the SME development market, because the PLCs and the SMEs, they are different outfits in terms of how they operate, what they build, where they build, etc., and how they run their models. 99% of the SME market are building well-designed, good boutique, specific schemes to that locality. Sometimes they might live in the area themselves. Often they know that people in the community that might be occupying these units.
Absolutely.
And so it's not true to say that they're just building it to the lowest possible cost and selling for the highest possible price. Now, That lowest possible cost has increased significantly, as we touched on earlier, but there should be an environment through the reduction of some of these regulatory pressure on the development space that allows developers to bring design-led, sensibly planned schemes to fruition in a short period of time.
Yeah.
You know, I feel that there's so much opportunity for governmental planning policy to say, like PD, which I think has been a great success on the UK market, is underutilized. Of course, it's going to, as more and more get taken up, it gets sort of more and more acute in terms of the effect. But it's a great way of utilizing
and refined over time as well, right?
Absolutely
so
refined.
It is good that they added natural light as a consideration to Class MA, for example.
Of course,
right? And it was kind of a government fuck up not to include natural light or minimum space standards.
Sure.
And now they've introduced that, so that's fine, right?
Yeah.
I think to a certain degree, all the low hanging fruit has now been picked around PD.
Sure, that's fair. But on that thread, we're not here to propose new government policy, but
are we?
Or are we? That's episode 2. But the thread of giving the market a set of rules or some pockets of the market that you go, if you bring us X, we'll give you Y.
Yeah.
Rather than sketch something up and we'll take a look. And if we don't like it, sorry guys, off you go, try again.
Well, what would you prefer to see different? Well, it's not my job to design it for you.
Indeed.
And it's like, due respect, we have designed it for you already.
This is the unknown, and this then translates into the lack of confidence for people to bring things forward, because I'm only just spitballing here, but for example, Croydon Council had a policy a few years back where if you had a single detached unit on a wide plot, they almost invented their own local government PD whereby you could get a consent for up to 9 flats on that plot. Obviously, a lot of those big units were taken up and Croydon had an influx of flats at that time, some good, some bad. But it was on the good side, what you could justifiably say is that it gave the market some rope to go out and say, we've got some confidence that if we buy that, if we cost it up and we design it properly, we know we're going to get a ticket on that, and we can raise money on that basis. What it doesn't help with is when you've got national planning policy being interpreted in 58 different ways with local government, and developers in those local markets, whether it's the London boroughs or across the country, are just sort of hitting and hoping within a very broad and extensive set of rules. Sometimes it comes down to things like, we just don't like the design. Well, okay, fine. As you say, what should we do differently then? Because we're trying to design the best we can with what we have available in a cost versus sale price appraisal. Can't just tell us you don't like it. You need to give us a fix. You need to give us, well, if you change this, I'm fine with that. It's too unaccountable to just say, sorry guys, go back to the drawing board, come back in 6 months.
And then I imagine head home at the end of the day and think, I did a great job because I stuck it to the man. It's like, I think a great job in planning and development has to be saying, how do we get there?
Yeah.
Not, well, this isn't it. And how do we get there is just the most important mindset that I would love to see more often.
I agree. And we spoke about it briefly before we turned the mics on, is the sort of incentive structure that exists within planning departments. And I'm going to give them credit where it's due, because I do think local government planning offices and their surrounding support teams are, of course, wildly under-resourced, wildly overworked, and I genuinely do sympathise because they've not got the capacity, the infrastructure, the payment structures, whatever they need to do this at a top-level efficiency. So they are probably, some maybe more than others, but they are probably doing the best with what they've got. Now, of course, that bar is too low, in my opinion. I think it's too low, and it's not acceptable as a nation to just go, well, that's where we are, lump it or leave it. We spoke about it before. The incentive structure is such that there is no downside or upside to a lack of decision making on a planning application to that local council.
Yeah.
And the sort of massaging of the figures in terms of the local plan and how they've got housing supply for the next few years, etc., is farcical sometimes.
It's just so completely and utterly divorced from reality.
It's so divorced from reality. And I'm not proposing that local councils go on some sort of commission structure for approving planning consents, because that would drive the wrong behaviours. But having an incentive structure there that if a scheme is submitted within an acceptable locality within that borough, if the design and the unit mix is within policy and within what we want for the borough in terms of the need and the 5-year supply, we need to find a damn good reason to not approve that. Otherwise, there should be some penalty to us for blocking what is someone fulfilling that need for us as local council. And yet what they're actually faced with at that juncture is we could approve this or we could not. And if we don't, it doesn't really matter on the grounds that we don't approve it, because you'll probably take it to appeal anyway. And then someone slightly more impartial and higher up might say yes. And so you've just added another 12 months onto your application. Yeah. And so that could have been done 12 months ago.
Yeah.
I struggle with that. In any private sector organisation of any success, the people and their performance are held to, depending on where you work, pretty exacting standards. If you're paid X amount to do Y job, make sure you turn up and do Y job really well, because that's what justifies your remuneration.
Yeah. And the planning system is designed and built on the assumption that the civil servants in local government are these like virtuous philosopher kings or queens or monarchs, philosopher monarchs, we'll say, who are going to operate under the assumption that they feel responsible for making sure enough homes are delivered.
Yeah.
And of course, that's not been borne out in reality. This is so regrettable. I think officers sometimes think that a good job means just kind of like twisting the screw as hard as they can for like extraction of public benefit. And also then saying, well, that's just housing, that's not a public benefit. Like, what?
Yeah. And it's not a yin versus yang. It shouldn't be us versus them. And I say us and them rhetorically. I just mean it shouldn't be the council versus the developer versus the council. This is a collaborative private-public sector merge of fulfilling, exactly as you said, a need for that local authority, which is housing, both private and affordable. And none of that happens without consents taking place in a reasonable space of time.
Yeah.
And without that collaborative approach, the whole thing grinds to a stop.
Yeah.
The main complaint I hear from the private sector SME development market is that they can't get a dialogue with a local authority. You don't have to go back that far in time to a time where the case officers would be on the phone, coming out to see you within a week or two, responding to emails,
100%,
giving you dialogue on, look, I like that, guys. I think you're on the right thread there, but if you wouldn't mind just pitching the roofs and taking out that end unit and, you know, maybe just moving the left boundary a little bit over, I think we've got something there.
And that could be a 5-minute phone call.
It's a 5-minute phone call.
Like, there's 2 parts to that, right? One is that could be a 5-minute phone call instead of like a carefully worded defensive email that might take 40 minutes.
Yeah.
And the other part of it is that in that kind of hypothetical, they're saying yes to this, no to that, maybe this, but we can come back to it and have another look, instead of, well, that might be acceptable subject to everything else. Well, that might be acceptable subject to everything else. Well, then what was the pre-app for? You know what I mean?
Well, indeed. And you've said no to something on the basis of one in amongst 100 variables, 99 of which were right. And you've said no to the whole thing because one tiny bit of it wasn't right.
Yeah.
And that lack of dialogue, we have a fair bit of development in Essex and East Anglia, amongst many other markets. Chelmsford Council, for example, you now have a blanket inbox. It's just a centralised, send it into here, and we'll see what comes back. That lack of human interaction, of course there might be bad actors out there that sort of abuse that and put undue pressure on councillors, but that is part of the job, I'm afraid. And it needs to be interactive for it to be efficient and cohesive, because without that, you're just hitting and hoping again.
Yeah, to really just be effective at all.
Indeed.
Just getting through that barrier of speaking to the officer is such a critically important part of the value that we add as planning agents. But it shouldn't be a skill set to get someone on the phone. And I get that, like, a lot of times a planning officer is sick of the abuse, is building a protective layer for themselves.
Yeah.
Right. Which then makes it harder for us to make that first contact so they can understand that we're not dicks. It's like, it's just endless.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Of course, we're really pleased with the fact that we do get through that initial barrier, and because we're not dicks, that eventually they get to know us and they're more likely to return a call or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So it's value that we add, but that's not what the job should be about. It doesn't need to be about that.
I actually don't think, and I don't in any way mean this as a critique of the sort of planning consultancy industry, because the technical aspects of planning are very complex. But actually planning as a concept shouldn't be complex because it's a conversation. Let's just break down the barriers a bit here, guys. We're trying to deliver you X. You've already told this market that it needs X, and we're hoping to give you X. What don't you like about X? Well, we don't like that. We do like that. I think you're on the right lines here. We could do that and that with it. Okay, we'll go away. We'll spend our money giving you what you've asked for. And then are we okay? Yeah, no worries. That's fine. Now, I've obviously diluted the whole process significantly there, but that is at its core simplistic form what planning is.
Yeah.
And yet we've extrapolated that and expanded it into this huge, complex spider's web of do that, and then get this consultant to look at that, and then get ecology out, and then do that, and then come back to me when you got that report, and then change that. But I also need to get it looked at by this person, and then we need to put it in front. And you think, you're just beating the market up at every turn.
It's that kind of doom cycle where the daylight sunlight surveyor has to do a retest during the determination period, which then means that the overheating engineer has to do another overheating assessment, and then the M&E engineer has to do another energy report because now you've got a fan, mechanical ventilation, you've got watch out climate change, there's a fan in the building. Yeah. But you can end up in a loop where you're doing that 4-5 full laps, right? To change not much. Yeah. So I appreciate that kind of acknowledgement that this is a simplistic picture, but it is fair enough to say none of this is that hard. And we're kind of making it harder for ourselves.
Yeah, we absolutely are. And if you expand that to national infrastructure projects, is it any wonder that these things are not getting delivered? Yeah. I'm amazed that we delivered Crossrail. I think it's a fantastic piece of infrastructure.
Oh, they smashed it. Gorgeous.
I think they've smashed it. I think London, in terms of its internal travel network, has improved considerably since the introduction of the Elizabeth line.
100%.
And credit to them. They've done a great job on it. I can't recall where it came in on budget, no doubt probably a fair bit over, but the concept of delivering something that complex in a city like London on a national public scale is impressive. HS2 and everything else that we try to build in this country, you go through 8, 9, 10 years of consultation. The extension to the Bakerloo line was proposed in something like 2015.
What about that hillside or that hillside, and what's the impact and views from the AONB? It's a railway line through a farm. No, it's not hard.
Yeah, you can't please everyone.
No.
Public consultation is an important part of development, and it should be done, but not at the expense of the national requirements. Yeah. And the national requirements as it relates to infrastructure and housing are still under-resourced. And we need to be able as a market to take action quicker than we're currently subjected to, because it's not extreme to say we will just stagnate if we're not able to develop. And as it relates to the roads, as it relates to housing, as it relates to train lines, infrastructure, new hospitals, schools, all of this comes down to funding at a local, private sector, public sector, national and local level. Yeah. The confidence for funding to get behind these projects is a requirement of a lack of excessive time taken to get to that first base.
What would you like to see in, say, the upcoming draft London plan? We're kind of talking about this overburdened Christmas tree that everyone's hanging their number one issue on and kind of grinds it to a halt. Does anything come to mind where you just think that's a really good example of something that we could probably just scope out because it's causing delays, but it's not actually delivering to a specific purpose?
It's a good question. I think some form of sped up process on retrofit or, existing building development refurbishment projects, which we're seeing an increasing appetite for because new build is so expensive at the moment that people are looking to existing buildings where demand perhaps has already been established, whether it's resi, student, rental accommodation, etc. And they are taking first generation old tired stock and bringing it back to a contemporary standard. Mm-hmm. To do that on a building and maybe add a floor, change a bit here, add some elevations, tart it up, shouldn't be a contentious planning application in my opinion. You're not building something new. You're improving the old. You've already said the old is fine. We're taking the old and we're bringing it back to life. Some efficiencies around that I think would help.
Well, I love that you mentioned the retrofit first idea because it's fascinating to me how planning seems to have just come to this concept. Like, oh yeah, we need to be retrofitting, not building. But I think that it really misses a trick here, because that's what the market would want to do anyway. It's less expensive to retrofit than demolish and rebuild in most cases.
Yeah.
There are going to be exceptions, of course. But the idea is that the market is already self-sorting. Like, that's what a change of use application is. It's a retrofit first policy.
Sure.
And everything that is working well for its purpose, you just don't see in planning because there's no application submitted, right? The building's just humming along. So I think that, that's sort of one where the cart's leading the horse a bit.
Yeah.
In terms of creating an additional reporting burden about the carbon cost of some limited excavation or demolition, or how many bricks are you going to recycle or reclaim. The market is kind of already on that. And so it's a reporting requirement that ignores that self-sorting that's already happening.
Yeah, I think so. And there's many things in the Bible of planning rules that seems to be growing by the year that would be right for change. But I think it comes back to what I was saying earlier in sort of giving the market some rope to say, actually, we feel like there's a lot of underutilized stock on a retrofit basis. Go out, bring us schemes on that basis, and you're already 30% there. You know, if you show us that you're doing a good job and you're bringing something sensible to the market, which is on that basis, it's not an automatic approval, but you know you're on the right lines.
It would be a total 180 then from the policies that exist in a lot of London boroughs, especially where they require 2 years of active vacant marketing. I understand the intentions behind it. I think that it has punitive effects on a neighborhood and on the applicant in a way that are probably too vindictive a way to meet that intended purpose of, say, like protecting Class A office space.
Yeah. If it was that desirable as a Class A office, do you not think it would be full? Yeah. You know, and do you not think it would be full after 3 months, 6 months? If the market has told you we don't need that anymore, it's not needed anymore.
And then when the market does need it again, you'll be seeing applications for that. Yeah. And a good example of this is the resurgence of the new build office market in the city, for example. A lot of really high profile permissions for a lot of office space.
Yeah. And I think that the UK media is its own worst enemy insofar as we are sometimes victims of our own doom mongering. We talk ourselves into periods of convincing ourselves that we're in this depressed, spiraling economy that can't be fixed.
Yeah.
There are plenty of challenges with the UK right now, but there are also plenty of opportunities. And the UK fundamentally is still a great place to live and work, still attracts international investment, still is the financial centre of the world in terms of the City of London. It still has a very services-based economy. Yes, we can sit here and moan about tax and regulation and planning and all this, but its core fundamentals are still good.
Absolutely.
And I think social media has got something to do with this, but I don't want to open that can of worms. But, you know, the headlines often don't tell the true picture. There was a headline not too long ago to say, HSBC is moving out of Canary Wharf. Disaster. Isn't this such a slight on the London office market, commercial investment, investor confidence? The actual story was HSBC are relocating, and BlackRock or Jane Street, one of the big American funds, have taken huge confidence in building a new office in, I think it's Aldgate. JP Morgan are doing the same. And you've actually got massive names committing to London as a market. Everything follows from that. We would do well actually to talk ourselves up a bit more sometimes.
When we do get into that kind of doom spiral or that doom loop, I think a lot of people have a natural reaction to then want to control things more tightly, to feel like, but if we don't control for everything, then this whole thing will fall apart, because they're experiencing the stress of trying to manage all of it. And so almost reflexively, then the grip gets tighter, when in reality, it would be a much greater benefit to everyone's mental health, but also to the economy, if we actually caught ourselves doing that and actually loosened our grip a little bit and just made life a little bit easier for ourselves.
Yeah.
And got a little bit more sort of reflection going about what the reporting requirements and the assessments and the discretion and the weaponized balance are like really all about. I'm curious as well from your perspective, what you like to see in a planning agent, or what you would love to see more of for planning agents.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think we are kind of one removed from the planning consultants and the agents, because it's generally our clients, the developers, that are employing those consultants. So we see it from slightly afar, albeit we may on occasion have interactions with them, but generally it's dealt with by the client.
Yeah.
The planning consultancy agency market is like any market insofar as there is a genuine need for that skill set and technical expertise that is worth a value, certainly if it secures you a consent that you otherwise wouldn't have got. So there's clearly a need and a value for that.
Yeah.
I think whilst planning agents, consultants may have all the info, all the technical expertise, the black book of contacts, they're still subject to the same set of rules that the client is. They're just a representative of the client. So them being there, you being there, doesn't fix the challenges that we've been through in this conversation. It just gives a client an outsourcing resource of taking on that fight. And so I think they're an absolutely necessary part of the market, but without fixing the playing field and the rule book, they're coming up against the same frustrations that the client would be if they were doing it in-house and direct.
It's really interesting, yeah. We definitely are proud of the ways that we de-risk an application by advising on the development of the scheme, lowering risk by hopefully shortening determination periods, lowering risk by coming up with planning strategies that have certain safeguards built in or see novel evidence-driven arguments, and all of the kind of nuances about strategy. So I think we're really aligned that like that's the value added.
Yeah.
Or dare I say, that should be even more of the time that we spend, right? Rather than making sure that once a week we beg the case officer to call us back.
Yeah. Part of your work is an unfortunate result of the issues that we've been through is chasing, just being a chaser. And you've done the technical skilled element of your work, but then just getting the answer is the chasing. I think at a national level, to fix this, apolitically speaking, whichever government's in charge need to take this by the horns and say, this is not working in the way that we want it to. And it probably does need to be relatively drastic in terms of the changes made. Now, that's on the...
Where are we going with this?
Well, it's more just... I don't want to turn this conversation into like a sort of all facets as we're trying to focus on housing and planning specifically. But just to quickly digress, it feels like so many pillars of the UK economy are at a point where they've been over-regulated and oversaturated with requirements to the point that they've almost ground to a halt. You know, can't fix the roads, you can't build enough houses, you know, you can't get a doctor's appointment. You've got this sort of list of complaints that people always reel off.
Yeah.
And the common theme amongst all of that is no one's had the minerals to just go in there and go, look, I know this just isn't working anymore. I'm sorry that we're at this stage. And here's a drastic fix. I'm not talking about extremist policies. I'm talking about taking a system that was built for the right reasons and saying, at the level we're at now, this doesn't work anymore. It doesn't mean we need to demolish it and start again, but we need to improve it.
100%. And I think we see that a lot. So when there's an opportunity for constructive criticism about how the sector operates and how the regulatory processes in the sector operate, like policy about 2 years vacant marketing for change of use might be an example of this, where you say, this isn't really working. And then the officer says, well, we need to protect Class A office space. That's the end of the conversation. Kind of makes me think of Zoolander, when Mugatu's like, I feel like I'm taking crazy pills. Like, why don't we have that conversation where we step back and actually cross-reference the forest and the trees instead of another tweak to the MPPF? What if we actually go into statute?
Yeah. And I think when we spoke earlier is the challenges in the residential market have led to our clients and developers across the country looking into alternative forms of development that previously they might have dabbled in, but now they're focusing on more specifically build to rent. We've touched on co-living, which is still sort of finding its feet, but is gaining some traction, albeit very market specific. PBSA across the country still has a need.
Yeah.
And then other sort of subsectors within that, hotels and apart hotels and serviced accommodation, that sort of thing. So there's plethora of market niches, but it's kind of a shame that the focus of the private sector has had to shift to all these alternative uses to make a deal work versus probably when they set out to buy that site, they just wanted to build some homes on it and sell them, ideally.
Yeah.
And the system has not allowed them to do that. And so the financial viability of that scheme has meant that they've had to turn to a different operational use for that site. So it's a very rapidly changing market. I think London is where it's being felt most acutely. the level of affordable housing provision expected. I'm going to set my stall out. I don't think the mayor does a great job of his messaging for the private sector. I think he comes across sometimes as very anti-growth and anti-sort of aspiration for the private sector. That's just my opinion. Whether you like him or loathe him, that's just my subjective view on how I think the messaging comes across.
I think there's a cognitive dissonance in the messaging overall, if I'm understanding where you're coming from. We need homes, we're delivering homes, we're unlocking sites, and then also we're holding these developers to account. I don't know. I would love to just workshop for a week with the GLA policy team and really understand. The thing that comes to mind is how they relaxed the expectations about dual aspect. Now they've come out with this revised guidance and they've said, well, single aspect may be acceptable subject to natural light, ventilation, and overheating all being acceptable. And it's that was always the case. And so they're kind of granting this this is a concession. And it's you're just describing what dual aspect was all about anyway.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how much it moves the needle, but that's the kind of tree that I think misses the forest.
I agree. And I don't think that a nation of homogenized, institutionally owned rental accommodation like some of the European markets is necessarily the answer for the UK. I think we need to get back to a point where the sales market can support the need for a growing population. Rental accommodation is useful for a period of time in people's lives. I personally don't think it is the right long-term solution for people across all of their life, subject to personal circumstances. For some people it works.
Yeah.
But I do think that culturally, that sort of old adage of the Englishman's home being his castle sounds a bit archaic now, but it is still a cultural narrative that exists. And we need to allow a system that is intertwined with that cultural background, which is, well, actually, people do want to own home. They do want to have equity in the market. They do want to be able to trade up and down at a sensible cost as families grow or shrink. Yeah. And at the moment, we're operating in a market where people are very stuck between making those moves. So institutional capital flowing into build to rent and co-living, look, it's good insofar as we're getting homes on the market and available and space available for people. The percentage outstrip of rent versus what it would be on a mortgage is, I think, getting too wide. Yeah. And we are exacerbating the problem by pushing people into longer term rental accommodation where that ability to afford a purchase has now been diluted even further because they can't save for the deposit or the stamp duty or the other things we discussed.
Completely agree.
Yeah.
Will, this has been a fascinating and fun conversation, so I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Make Planning Make Sense. Please do give the show a follow and please share the show to keep the conversation going and the community growing. Find us on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky at MPMS Podcast, or write to us at podcast@centroplan.co.uk. Make Planning Make Sense is presented by Centro Planning Consultancy and recorded in beautiful London, England. Its executive producer is me, Aaron Zimmerman. Marketing and promotion by our colleague Reese Raymond. Graphic design by our colleague Mariam Malaxi. Music by Joseph McDade. From all of us here at Centro, thanks again for listening.